Hey everybody, welcome to Miami. Believe it or not, this is more Miami than the city that we know today. This is what Miami used to look like. You can see behind me that there are slash pines, there's these palmettos in the understory, it's a kind of open understory, and there's these weird black marks on all the trees. Well, that's because this habitat is called Pine Rockland and it burned. The area that Miami is in right now burned. It was a fire adapted ecosystem. This is called Pine Rockland. It's one of the most endangered habitats in the state of Florida, probably one of the most endangered habitats in the US. Outside of Everglades National Park, less than 2% of this habitat is left. Again, you have a slash pine canopy, you have this understory, and naturally this would have been much more open, much more grassy, little open patches of rock, because really what we're standing on is basically a layer of limestone called oolitic limestone. And unfortunately, you can see that these palmettos have kind of grown up behind me. There's not a lot of open ground. That's because the habitat we're in right now is totally surrounded by development. There's a big highway there, there's a housing development there, apartment complexes there, and a strip mall right over there. And so land managers here have a really tough time burning and getting this habitat into the shape it needs to be in. So as we go through the day, we're going to explore some other habitats around Miami, and I'm excited to show you them. But keep in mind, these are just little islands of habitat, little fragments of what Miami used to be. The Miami Pine Rocklands are home to so many endangered species of both plant and animal. The animals range in size from the tiny little miniature Miami tiger beetle, which is federally endangered, up to a really interesting mammal that's only found basically in the Pine Rocklands. And that animal actually lives behind me. Above me, over my shoulder, is a bat box, actually two bat boxes, for the Florida Bonneted Bat. This is probably the rarest mammal species in the United States, arguably, and it's found in these tiny little remnants of Pine Rockland where it forages among the pines and roosts in either natural tree cavities or in the boxes like this. Unfortunately, with so much habitat being lost, there's not a lot of tree cavities left for it to roost, and so a variety of different agencies, but mainly the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, have installed these bat boxes to try to help the species out. And it's just kind of neat that this little remnant of habitat still has a species as cool as that. So all of Miami wasn't Pine Rockland. Pine Rockland occurred in the upland areas, and the upland areas, of course, were the first places to be developed. But in some of the more wet areas, there was another habitat called tropical hardwood hammock. And this is a true example of actually subtropical forest in the United States. So you'll see behind me, there's strangler figs, wild coffee, these really crazy ferns in the understory. There's actually a little cave over to my right, and on the sides of the cave is another kind of neat microhabitat within a microhabitat. So these hardwood hammocks are shaded and they're a little bit cooler and wetter. But then you have these little caves and sinkholes that create an even more wet and humid microclimate. And on the edges of the limestone in these caves, you have a huge diversity of endangered species of ferns. And so right over my shoulder, there's several actually state-listed ferns growing on the edge of this limestone. So again, you know, Miami used to be a really special place, and while a lot of this habitat's gone, at least we have these little remnants to kind of remember what was, and we still have some native species that we can appreciate here in these habitats. We're in another section of tropical hardwood hammock, which again is one of the rarest habitats in the Miami region, but unfortunately it's a habitat that is very subject to being invaded by exotic species. So virtually every plant species behind me, from the skunk vine and the air potato, we have invasive ferns, we have this plant that's climbing up the trees, invading the trees. It's just covered in invasives. Unfortunately, these hammocks, because they are so tropical, are a great home for the plants that we kind of cast aside or that we put in our gardens and forget about. Those plants spread, they cover the native vegetation, and you have not only these rare habitat remnants, but you have these rare habitat remnants that are covered with invasives that are replacing the native species. So not only do you have to protect the habitat, you also have to manage it well. And clearly this is an example of management not happening very well. So right now I'm in a fragment of pine rockland that gives me a lot of hope. This is a tiny, tiny little postage stamp of a preserve. It's probably less than 10 acres. You can see behind me that there's a school, there's houses right over there, and right over there. It's an island. And yet, look at that. See all that black on the slash pines? That's from a fire. This little tiny postage stamp of a property was prescribed burned less than 2 years ago. And as you can see, there's open, grassy understory, there's sections of exposed ground. You can see the oolitic limestone on the forest floor. This is what this habitat should be. And yeah, all we're left with are these tiny little pieces, these fragments of habitat, but if we manage them correctly, we can still see some of the native plants and animals that once occurred throughout the Miami region. And that fills me with hope.